So let's talk about, leadership. There's been some really tough leadership decisions that you've had to make over the last few years. You talk about, the big floods that were in South Dakota, and that's fascinating. But let's kind of move ahead a little bit to COVID. Mm-hmm. You have the interesting distinction in your state of never having mandated business closures. Mm-hmm. One state out of 50.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so how did that happen?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It was a pretty lonely job for a period of time, because while I was making the decision not to shut anything down, not even define what an essential business was in my state, because I didn't believe that governments had the ability to tell you your business wasn't essential. I was getting criticism not just from Democrats. I was getting criticism from other Republicans, from my supporters, from people that had known me my whole life that were calling and saying, Christy, get in line with these other governors. This is going to be politically destruction for you. You need to, do what they're all doing. So it was pretty lonely. But I'd spent a ton of time, not only with health officials, but also with constitutional attorneys, and knew what my job was and knew what my job was not, what authority I had. And at the end of the day, I wanted to make sure that I could look back years from now and be proud of the fact that I did my job and only my job. So I'm just a big believer that if leaders do overstep their authority, especially in a time of crisis, that's when we break this country. And I didn't want to be that person.
You did institute a state of emergencies. That's actually an interesting question because, obviously that exists for situations that are emergencies. It is a kind of overreach, but it's the one that everyone agrees to, right?
Well, yes. So what the state of emergency actually does is it allows you to coordinate with other governments as well, with local and with the national and federal government as well. So when you declare that, it gives you the ability to streamline through regulations, cut time frames, shorter so you can respond quicker, and to partner with the federal government and get resources in ways that you just can't without that state of emergency. So we did have that for a period of time. And then we also, I think we're the first state to let it go and to let it not be in place anymore and recognize that life had to return back to normal, that we could, knowing what we knew about the virus, not have to worry about necessarily that expedited approval process and make sure that we followed through on still taking care of people. I think what's important is we saw in so many different states people penalize others for not falling in line, enforcement mechanisms that were not possible. We certainly made recommendations, but in every emergency declaration or executive order that I had, the language was clearly in there that it said shall if possible, should if possible, which meant to the people that I believed strongly they should do this if it was possible for them to do so. Leaving that flexibility was incredibly important for me.
Obviously, people's right to make decisions about their lives very important to you. Mm-hmm. We can see how the farm life contributed to you thinking this way. So right now, I think you're in a position where because none of these businesses were locked down or closed, that the state's doing pretty well.
Yeah, the state's doing fantastic. And I'd say that's a direct result of the people. It's amazing the things that they did to come together to really tell the story of South Dakota, to invite people to come and visit us. A lot of the people who came to visit us in 2020 were so inspired by what they saw of this state protecting freedom. They went back home, packed up their families, and moved. We have tens of thousands of new people that have moved to South Dakota. Hundreds of new businesses. Our economy's the strongest economy in the nation. Our kids are leading the nation in educational outcomes. Our incomes are going up faster than anywhere else. We are just really doing extremely well and have less than 1,000 people in the entire country or in the entire state that are on unemployment. So it's really a testimony to doing what conservative people believe in and what we've always said we believed in, actually doing it. And it worked.
Some of the criticism you got early on, I remember seeing it, was simply that you're not following the science.
No, that's true, but the science that they were saying was science was not even true. I started talking to health experts that they were referencing. I also went further and looked at other studies, talked to other people in other countries, states that were on the ground, dealing with people that were sick in other areas of the country before it ever got to South Dakota. I think that perspective helped a lot. And one thing that I saw leaders do too often was focus on the national news, what they were hearing in the news, and not really shutting that off and looking at what was happening in their states, what was happening in these towns, because that was the perspective you needed to keep on really how to take care of people. Talk to those doctors that were in those hospitals on what was working and what wasn't, and using the research of what we knew for viruses. What they told me before it ever got to South Dakota was that I would have over 300,000 people that would be dead from the virus if I didn't do certain things. Well, the more you researched it, you could tell that what they were recommending wasn't going to be the correct response to how we really get through this in a long term. Sustainability was a big conversation. You can tell people, President Trump recommended that everybody stay home for 2 weeks. And I think virtually everybody in the country stayed home for 2 weeks. In South Dakota, I recommended that people listen to the president and stay home if they could. But after that, you realize, how long can we do this? And that was a big factor for me too, is what is a mechanism, something we can tell people would be a good thing to do, but that they could do for 6 months or they could do for a year, because doing something for a short period of time only would delay the amount of sickness and the bubble and the curve that we were all looking at coming. So that was, that perspective of having a balanced approach was really important.
You put a lot of value in sort of maintaining only your constitutional authority and nothing more. That's what you referenced. Why?
It's my job. I guess I've learned an appreciation for that. I've seen enough policy get overturned in court because it went beyond what the authority was that was given to either the legislative branch or to the executive branch. I've watched throughout the years, I screw up every day. And that's the thing that I think is important in this country, is I'm not perfect, but I do want to be teachable. And, I've had different positions over the years while I've been in elected office that I've been very clear on, and then I learn more on an issue, and I think, well, you know what, there is another side to this story, and if I'm going to learn more or have a little bit of a different perspective, that's a good thing to explain to people. So for me, the one thing that's consistent, that's protected this country for hundreds of years, is literally the framework that our founders gave us. And it is what, you can't go wrong as long as you start with a good foundation. It'll keep you even during the shakiest times. So many times throughout the last several years as governor, that was my guiding light to come back to our state constitution, our U.S. Constitution, to really understand what my role was as governor, because it's a very different role than serving in Congress. And it was a very different job. So that's what I needed to make sure that I was always remembering was, while I did this job for 8 years, now I'm in a different role, and this is the authority that I have, and I need to make sure that I follow that guideline, that job description.
You got a lot of criticism a while back when you declined to sign this law about preventing transgender women from participating in women's sports. And, subsequently, you worked on this issue. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of speak to what was going on, what your thoughts are on this, how it works for you. Yeah.
I'd worked on this issue for many years. In fact, back when I was in Congress, the federal government came in and told the state of South Dakota, told our sport of rodeo, that they could no longer have girls' events and boys' events, that we had to eliminate all that and never reference boys or girls in the sport of rodeo in our state. Well, serving in Congress at the time, I was furious. Of course, I'm passionate about rodeo as well. And I remember trying to get them to change their position and not getting any help from my colleagues. I didn't get any help from my delegation even. Nobody wanted to touch this issue because it was so politically charged. They knew that it would be a fight and that it would look like there would be bias against transgender individuals. But I pushed and eventually got the federal government to back off. And to this day in South Dakota, we still are allowed to have girls' events and boys' events in the sport of rodeo. So I was really surprised at the criticism that I received when the first bill came forward on girls' sports in South Dakota. I've always supported only girls playing in girls' sports. But the legislature gave me a bill that was very flawed. The bill they put on my desk would have been put in court immediately because of the way it was drafted. It did not define a lot of definitions in the bill, performance-enhancing drugs. It put liability issues on schools that would be hundreds of millions of dollars if one student on an athletic team used an asthma inhaler or got a cortisone shot. The entire school could be sued for hundreds of millions of dollars just because those definitions weren't there. What I did was go back and change that bill and send it back to the legislature and ask them to accept the changes. They refused to. Therefore, the bill died. And that very same day, I signed executive orders in the state of South Dakota saying that only girls could play in girls' sports at the K-12 level and the collegiate level. The reason that I did that is because it was important to me to protect those sports. I knew that if I had signed a flawed bill, it would immediately be challenged in court, and while it was in court, I wouldn't be able to enforce anything. And it could be tied up for several years, and they would normalize boys playing in girls' sports in our state, and by the time we got done with the legal challenges, it'd be very difficult to change people's hearts and minds again. So instead, when the legislature did not accept my changes, I did executive orders to protect our sports until I could run a bill this year. And this year we ran the strongest bill in the nation that will withstand any court challenge, and I signed it into law. It was the very first law that I signed into place during our legislative session this year. So, my leadership has been very clear on this issue. I saw that, I've always been attacked by liberals. This was interesting to me because it was the first time I was attacked by my friends. I realized how competitive even conservatives can be if they think that they've got an area they can attack you on for a future race if they want to. But, those executive orders nobody's reported on. I signed those executive orders the very day the bill died the first time in South Dakota, and not a single reporter covered it. The truth of the fact that I was taking action to protect girls' sports. So I do appreciate you letting me clarify that, and that's why I wrote about it in my book, was because I think people need to know the truth and understand that even our friends on the right don't necessarily always tell the truth about what really happened.
Well, and decision-making is complicated.
Well, and as my husband would say again, I chose the hard path. He said, you could have easily signed a flawed bill, and it could have ended up in court, and maybe you would have been able to get another bill passed before that one was overturned. And I said, but I couldn't take the risk of setting precedent in court. I didn't want to take that kind of risk that we'd have a court decision now we'd have to deal with that really did jeopardize protecting girls' sports. So it was the hard path to do, but it was the right one.